Hello everybody, welcome back to Munich. We've been doing a series of shows from the 20th anniversary of the DLD conference in Munich, and perhaps the loyalist of the DLDers is my guest today, an old friend, Esther Dyson. Esther, have you been to every DLD?
I think so, but I wouldn't swear to it.
Do you remember what you were doing in January of 2005? It seems an awful long time ago now.
Yeah, to be honest, no, but it was kind of the end of my 25-year stint at Adventure, PC Forum, the newsletter Release 1.0. And I was looking forward to a life of freedom and just more variety. It was kind of, there was a reason I was selling the company. It was not, my goal was not really for that to last forever. It was my own education, and I felt my education was enough so that I should go off and start being an investor and kind of dabble in more things, which I did for a whole bunch of years, and I'm sure you'll ask more about that. But it was the beginning of a transition time, and interestingly, it's the same this time around. My 10-year Wellville project, the formal part of it has just ended, though we're hoping that what the people we were working with learned from us is living on in what they're doing now.
Esther, many people claim to be a founder of this whole technological revolution, which, for better or worse, is changing and has changed the world. But you can claim to be, I think, a parent as much as anyone. You've been around, I don't mean to age you, but you've been around really since the beginning, one of the observers, one of the networkers. Do you think of yourself, in a sense, as a parent of all this?
No, I think of myself as the aunt. You know, your aunt doesn't pay for you, and she doesn't punish you, but she's got your back. She gives you advice. She tells you how to negotiate things, but she's not the one in charge. Or alternatively, I call myself the court J, capital E-S-T-H-E-R, court jester. It's the person who's there, who's not an institution, but actually a person. They can talk to the king, they know what's going on, they keep secrets, but they also manage to tell the truth without naming names, usually.
Esther, for some of our audience, they're not going to be familiar with your pre-2005 history, but before TED, before DLD, before all the big TED conferences, you brought people together. Is that a fair generalization for your contribution to the technological revolution almost in the 25 years before 2005?
Precisely. But I brought people together, and I wrote a newsletter that explained what was really going on. I was writing about AI in 1986, Doug Lennett, people like that, who were building ontologies and models of the world rather than things that sort of parrot what people are saying. My conference was called PC Forum, Personal Computer Forum, back in 1982 when I bought it from Ben Rosen. And when it ended in 2007, it was called PC Forum, Platforms for Communication. And I loved that. It was one of the places where the industry gathered to talk to themselves rather than conferences held for customers. And so people would more or less tell the truth because they knew the people they were talking to knew the truth. And it was a wonderful 25 years. And then it was time for me and for other people to move on. So what I'm doing now, I'm beginning to construct the innards of a book that's going to be called Term Limits. And term limits is not so much about ending as it is passing along. How do you get something to the stage where you've done what you can do and now you want to hand it to someone else, which is what we're doing at Wellville. And me personally, I want to help people understand that we don't want to live forever.
There's There's a philosopher at DLD this week, Roman
Yes,
Krasnarich.
who's talking right now, and I'm so sorry to miss
Right,
him.
and he's been on the show. He
Yeah.
has a book out about
Yeah.
how to be a good ancestor, and you're talking about the same thing.
Right, and this is actually the logo of Long Now, of the interval, which is Long Now's business model. I was
Which
on the
is
board.
Stuart Brand's initiative. But so in terms of this responsibility, ancestral responsibility, as to, talk about an arm, but you're from a very distinguished tech family. Your father was one of the 20th century's foremost
Not tech, science.
science.
I mean, there is a difference.
Well, scientific families. Your
Yeah.
father was one of the 20th century's most iconic physicists. I'm not sure if he was in the Oppenheimer movie, but if he wasn't, he probably should have been.
No, but that Oppenheimer was my dad's boss.
Right, so he was part of that community. So, in terms of the aunt-like quality, do you feel a kind of ancestral responsibility towards tech/science?
No, I feel a sort of ancestral responsibility towards people. And understanding science is part of it. But, my goal is not to help science. It's to help people use science and tech more wisely. And that means being aware of their own motivations as humans. It's not simply understanding science, but it's understanding yourself. And then you can manipulate yourself instead of letting the content on the internet or the business models of the businesses manipulate you.
I want to get to your initiatives in a second, Esther. Over the last 20 years, you've done an incredible number of things, astonishing, really. Prolific. But have you been surprised, as someone who observed tech very carefully before 2005, during the age of exuberance, the dot-com boom, all the optimism about the internet, have you been surprised or shocked or disappointed about the shift in the zeitgeist and the increasing suspicion and even hostility towards the digital revolution over the last 20 years?
Surprised? Probably no, partly because I've never been foolish enough to expect things. People like to call me a futurist, but I say, I'm a presentist. And you need to understand the present to have influence on the future rather than just sit around and predict it. But I'm definitely disappointed. The one regret about my first book is I was way too optimistic about people's own self-awareness, their ability to engage and understand about privacy issues and so forth. And now the readiness to accept things like AI girlfriends, and it's scary. So some people are scared of some AI becoming sentient and doing crazy things. I'm scared of something much more systemic, which is, in the end, humans evolved based on a fitness landscape that culls the vulnerable. And our fitness landscape has changed now to include bad food, but bad food that's addictive. And so a huge part of the population is vulnerable to bad food, and now to what I call information diabetes, which is bad content. And it's very appealing. It tastes good. Your short-term metabolism sucks it up, but it destroys your mind and your body. And there's another fitness landscape emerging, which is all the business models that are being enabled and strengthened and sort of exponentially implemented using AI. It's not the AIs themselves, but that interaction between our human metabolism is not just sugar, it's also money, for better or worse. And the way to make more money, turns out, what is it the AIs really want? It's just like us, it's not sentient. They want electricity and data sets. And if you look what's happening right now, the fitness landscape is encouraging human beings running businesses to provide more data sets and more electricity for the AI. And it's not the AI saying they're give it to us. It's, again, this sort of fitness landscape complex system that is creating a drive towards providing more and more electrical power and ultimately real power to AIs who are not sentiently demanding, but are just like us, consuming with an insatiable desire for more power and electricity and creating models that will enable them to flourish.
Yeah, it's a fascinating observation that AIs have a kind of subconscious, a desire for electricity. Speaking of...
Just a moment. Subconscious indicates there's a conscious. It's simply
Right.
it's an innate, it's a metabolic. So when life began, it was metabolism that sucked up energy and then kept growing. And then later on, consciousness and all this other stuff emerged. And
so maybe we can call it a sub-metabolism.
Yeah, well, it's a metabolism. It's a pre-conscious, perhaps is a better word.
So a pre-consciousness. Speaking of fitness, you talked about mental and physical fitness and their intimacy.
Yeah.
Every time I see you, especially at DLD or one of these other events, you're always remarkably fit. I know you swim avidly.
Right.
How many miles do you think you've swum in the last 20 years?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I started when I was 18. I could do the math, but not right now, not in my head.
A lot of miles, though.
A lot of miles, yeah.
Probably across the Atlantic. You could probably swim back to New York, where you live, from Munich, if Munich had a coast. But in all seriousness, Esther, there is an intimacy in your mind between physical and mental fitness, isn't there? And that, in some ways, is part of the narrative of the last 20 years of your life.
They're certainly interdependent. The narrative is more moving from tech to...
Wellness.
Forgive me, but I hate that word wellness. It sounds like ladies in spas. And
I apologize.
I mean, so...
Although you've used that word.
No, I've called it Wellville because...
Yeah.
But the word, it's interesting because we talk about poverty. We don't talk about poverty prevention. We talk about economic development. And the closest thing I can come to, honestly, is resilience. Because the reality is exercise is stress. Too much exercise can kill you. Brian Johnson. But stress, when you're capable of responding to it, strengthens you. Stress, when you're not capable of responding to it, harms you and can ultimately kill you. So it's how do you create the resilience that enables you to take on more stress and become stronger, rather than so many kids get damaged in the first 5 years of their lives, both emotionally and physically. And that's happening around the world now with, on the one hand, ultra-processed foods, blah, blah, hello, R.F. Kennedy, and also parents who are absorbed on their cell phones, parents who are too poor to have the time or capacity or resilience to take care of their kids. And I wrote a piece for The Information called "Don't Fuss About Training Your AIs, Train Your Babies." Because, again, we need healthy humans to respond to all the stresses of the predatory business models and so forth. And so that's been the narrative for me of the last 20 years. So for 5 years after ending PC Forum, I had this wonderful life, but no real center of gravity. Started looking at healthcare and then realized it's not the care. And shout out to Stuart Brand. He's now writing a book, I don't know if you know this, on maintenance.
No, I didn't know. John Markoff was on the show a couple of weeks ago, actually, and he mentioned talking to Stuart because he's his biographer. I didn't know he was writing a book.
Yeah, that's going to be great.
I have to get him on the show.
You should. Because perhaps the seminal moment for me in that was I talked to this guy, Charlie Silver, who had a website called realage.com, which still exists. The idea was to measure your real age versus your chronological age, and it did so by asking you, do you live with a partner? Do you have a pet? how do you eat. It was sort of focused on lifestyle and behavior. It didn't really address some of the real problems, which are racism and toxic parents and poverty. But nonetheless, it was a cheesy website. The business model was selling vitamin supplements. But I said, and I still believe, this website probably did a lot more good for a lot more people than a bunch of doctors. And the most interesting thing about Charlie Silver, who later sold this company to Hearst and then to ShareCare, was whom he sold his first company to. And that was Jiffy Lube, which does oil change for cars. And, oh, I get it. They're both about maintenance. And we do a better job maintaining our cars because our cars don't eat bad food, so to speak. They do whatever the owner of the car does for them. And I began to focus more on, well, how do we keep people healthy instead of making a lot of money repairing them when they get sick? And that ultimately led to me founding Wellville.
I want to get to Wellville in 1 second, but I'm just curious. I've never really asked you about this. What's your opinion of the Kurzweil school? Of this dream or promise of potentially living forever?
So you can get the answer by the name of my book, Term Limits. I don't think it's good for it. I don't want... we need to replace things, and we need to prepare the world for the people who replace us. So, Roman Krznaric is much more in line with what I'm thinking about. If you're a public company CEO, when you retire, you don't want the stock to go up, but you don't want it to go down either, because if it goes down, it means you didn't prepare the succession. You didn't hand along something in good shape. You handed along something damaged. And so Term Limits is about finding the scale, the focus. What am I going to do in the world? How well can I do it? Where should I do it? For how long? It's not as if there's one term limit for everybody, but a sense that your job is not to fix everything. Your job is to fix the part you can do and then hand along something somewhat better for the next person, company, whatever, to take on.
Yeah, I think it's a very timely book in an America where you have the Bidens and the Pelosi's, certainly on the progressive side, who don't know how to leave the stage. So Term Limits suggests that everyone should acknowledge that at a certain point they need to leave the stage gracefully and responsibly.
Yes, but it's not just time. It's also, what am I good? And this is the problem with effective altruism. It's like there's one scale for everybody. No. I think the environment is very important, but I'm really not focused on it. My focus is on the human consciousness and wellness, if you like, primarily. And other people are, it's understanding where you can be useful and most useful. I mean, your purpose is to live a good life. It's not to fix the universe, and that good life includes whatever you're good at, but it also has an end.
Do you, when you look back at the last 20 years, do you feel you've been useful?
Actually, yes. Thank God. I mean, if I died tomorrow, I would say, well, I used the time I had. And that's what you really want to do.
So how have you used the time? Is it mostly, when you think about the value of the last 20 years, is it mostly in Wellville or other things you've been doing?
It's Wellville. It's a lot of other people I've worked with, and I'm always, how shall I say, I'm always sort of surprised and flattered when people come to me for advice. But I think I've given some pretty good advice over the years. I mean, there are lots of people I can point to there where I've just been helpful. And I feel, again, I don't feel I'm done, but I feel I've been useful up to this point. My term limits are, my goal is to retire on Mars, but not for 30 years or so.
And explain what you were trying to do at Wellville and what you actually did do.
Okay. So the first thing was, people say, did it turn out the way you expected? And I didn't really expect something in particular. I knew I and we, our team, and the communities we worked in would learn a lot. My hope was that they would, the goal was to help them build their own sustainable resilience, not for us to give them something or to walk in with a program. And it probably was a bit less techy than I would have guessed going in. It was originally 5 years, 5 metrics, 5 communities. Over time, 2 of the communities, we swapped them out for different communities. It moved from 5 years to 10 years. It was always supposed to be a project, not an institution. And we just, I'm a nice white lady. I learned about racism, I learned about addiction, all these things I kind of knew about. Now I understand them much more intimately. From the community's point of view, we encourage them to collaborate rather than to compete for short-term grants that made them enemies of other entities in the community. And addiction is not just people and drugs. It's community organizations and short-term grants. It's VCs and exits. It's, people in social media. All these things are, in some way or other, a craving for relief that never quite satisfies. And so we became much more conscious, again, of the role of time and timing in pretty much everything. And this need for satisfaction. But the whole point of life is that there's continual change. You need to keep making progress in a meaningful way rather than just grabbing things short term. So we learned what it's like to live in a real community, how slow things are. And I'd say we learned the importance of collective funding, because children, education, all these things, they're not assets owned by a single person. They are assets that also benefit the community. And in this world right now in the US, the federal government needs to be more responsible for investing in its people, which is education, childcare, the wages of people. And even as AI makes businesses more effective, that should create more funding for the training, education, care of human beings. As I said before, giving them the self-awareness they need to live in this world.
Esther, you mentioned that in 30 years' time you intend to retire to Mars, but you've been doing some extra earthly, if that's the right word, investigations or travels of your own over the last 20 years. Is that right?
I think so. I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, you've dabbled, if that's the right word, in as a cosmonaut.
Yeah, well, I trained as a backup to Charles Simone, spent 6 months in Russia in Star City.
And I don't mean, when I say dabbled, I don't mean to patronize you in any way.
It was, my life is an education. Everything I do is, I pay for the education and then there's a lottery ticket attached, whether it's the ability to go into space, which, because I was a backup, if Charles had not gone, I might have been able to go. When I invest in a startup, I invest early. The chances of making a huge gain are pretty low per investment, but net if you invest in enough of them, you get lucky, which is what happened to me. But I invest in things where I know I will learn something. It's a person I believe in, or a cause, or a thing that I think should exist. I like things to be useful. What
investment over the last 20 years are you most proud of? Not necessarily because of the return, but just because of the adventure or the excitement or the opportunity.
I wouldn't use the word proud, but happy about. Everything from Space Adventures, which certainly has not returned financially, but it was because I was an investor in Space Adventures that they said, hey, would you like to train as a backup? And what I knew I would get and what I wanted to get out of that was really two things. One was to learn intimately about space travel, and the training was all about space medicine and space plumbing, and I would eat dinner with the NASA astronauts who were training there, because all the lift to the space station at that point was the Russian space company, Roscosmos. I also wanted to learn about Soviet Russia, and this was 2008 to 2009, but so Soviet Russia in theory was gone, but this was a government facility. You needed a pass to get in and out, and so I got all that, and the lottery ticket didn't pay off, but it was a perfect investment. Square, as in block, was basically what paid for Wellville, along with some Facebook stock. Both of those were sheer luck. I invested in 23andMe and learned a ton about genetics, and I'm friends with Ann Wojcicki and her mother Esther Wojcicki, who's here at
Yeah, and Esther's been on the show too a couple of times.
Yeah, I've learned, I got my money out of that too, although it wasn't in the form of money, but learning about genetics and just, that's what you take with you. The money comes and goes, but the education, ironically, the use of money has term limits, the education lives with you.
Yeah, you pay for a front seat.
Yeah.
Literally, perhaps, when it comes to space travel. I want to come back to space in a second,
Sure.
Esther. But you talked a little bit about your interest in the Soviet Union. You've had an unusually close relationship on and off with Russia. You've traveled there a lot. Have you been surprised over the last 20 years with the trajectory of Russian history under Putin? Did you expect it in 2005?
No. I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier. I wasn't expecting something in particular, but I've definitely been disappointed. The U.S. came in and unfortunately kind of brought the worst of capitalism to very fertile soil. What I like to say is that there's the religion of kind of human equality, socialism, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. And then there was the very, very corrupt church of communism. And likewise, there's the religion of the free market. People are free, resources are allocated effectively. And then again, there's the church of corrupt capitalism, predatory private equity, all that kind of stuff. And the Russian, how shall I say, the Russian soil was very fertile for predatory capitalism as opposed to the clean free markets. And I liken Putin, frankly, to a metastatic cancer. I'm not sure he was the original tumor, but the society is riddled with corruption and cynicism, deaths of despair. That was where I first understood about sort of alcohol and drugs as a response to basically a toxic environment that people were growing up in. And so the vulnerabilities were there. I didn't see them as clearly, but yeah, it's been the early 2000s were amazing because people were excited, there was hope, and then somehow that culture of bribery, government control, the people in power sucking the money and the energy out of the economy. I mean, so much of the Russian economy is subtracting value from stuff and then selling it abroad. And the only way you can really survive in a society like that is, either as someone who has no power or someone who abuses their power. And So from my time in Russia, I learned so much about the rest of the world and some sense of what's happening in the rest of the world right now.
Yeah, you mentioned Deaths of Despair. Of course, the author of that, Anne and Angus Deaton, he's been on the show. A lot of the work for that book was taken from the US. You talk about the metastatic cancer in Russia. What about in the US? Is there an intimacy between what's happened in the US and the shift seeming towards certainly illiberalism, maybe or even authoritarianism, deaths of despair, addiction in the United States and Russia? Are those two separate subjects? You're unusually global, Esther. I mean, you travel still more than almost anyone on Earth. But you live in New York, so you're perhaps more familiar with the United States than you are with any other country. What's your take on what's happened in America over the last 20 years?
My take is I learned more about, from going to Russia, I know something about Russia, but it really helped me understand what is happening now in the U.S., which is depressing and scary. The expression turtles all the way down.
No.
And it's sort of about science, what's underneath turtles? Well, there's turtles beget turtles.
Oh, I see.
And there's I would say a parallel but other direction, unexplainable humans all the way up.
Mm.
And we as a society, number one, when most people I know say we, they mean people like them rather than all of America. And the Democrats in particular just kept ignoring the fact that half the country didn't agree with them and felt dismissed and disrespected by the Biden administration, the well-meaning intellectuals who talked about poor people but didn't really understand their lives and blithely went to conferences like BLD and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, we've got a country where suddenly, and again, I can't predict the future, but I'm looking at the present. Yeah, the distinction between nation states and governments and people like Elon Musk on the one hand, all the different kind of freedom protest movements, some of which are focused on freedom, and so many of them, it's just one autocracy replacing another. It's like what we saw in the Middle East. It wasn't the real rise of freedom. It was just another dictatorship moving in. It's scary what's going on, and in a sense the biggest problem is that the vast majority of people they're focused on politics and politicians and TV shows and influencers rather than actual policies. They're not voting for policies. It's too complicated, and they did not learn civics, let alone psychology or self-awareness, either in school or from their parents. And so you have a hugely uninformed, short-term oriented, often not very healthy population, either physically or mentally, voting for short-term relief, not for long-term capacity. And it is scary, which is why I'm on your show, it's not as if...
Hoping to scare people even more. I wonder what your take was on the Luigi Mangione assassination. The reason I bring it up is it occurred to me that, I think I've talked about this on previous shows, that there's a Russian quality to Mangione. He reminds me in some ways of 19th century Russian aristocrats who went around assassinating ministers for one reason or another. This notion of this ethical, this simplistic ethic of dividing the world into extreme good and evil.
As opposed to term limits.
Right, as opposed to term limits. And Mangione, he's clearly a rather disturbed young man. But part of the elite. There is a younger generation that are, for better or worse, like aristocrats, the children of the rich and powerful in America. Is there, do you think, in America, leaving aside the Soviet analogy, is there something of Russia in the 19th century, this aristocratic society falling apart?
Yes, it's certainly one interpretation. I mean, my reaction to this is hate the sin, but love or reform or forgive the sinner, and go after the predatory, sinning business model. I don't know Brian Thompson, the guy who was killed, or who Mangione killed. I reject the use of the passive voice. People don't fall out of windows, they get pushed. Brian Thompson was in a company, he reported to somebody who reported to a board of directors, who reported to investors, who had this Friedman-esque, all we got to do is make profits. That's our job as a company and as directors.
That's Milton Friedman rather than Thomas Friedman.
Yes, exactly. So, the guy was kind of doing his job just the way the communists all did their jobs, and the people who take bribes are doing their jobs because their salaries are so low, and so, he was wrong to kill the guy, that's clear. On the other hand, the system in which Brian Thompson worked, and I know nothing about how bad he was personally or good he was personally, but the problem is the system. It wasn't Brian Thompson personally. And so killing him was wrong. Mangione should have, gone and become a spokesperson for goodness or something, I don't know. But yeah, again, people are doing things that express their emotions, but that don't solve the problems. They're voting for Trump to express their emotions, but they're not. Most of the people who voted for Trump do not know the likely impact of most of his policies, put it that way.
Yeah, I'm sure he
including
does.
Trump himself.
Yeah, and it's, again, thinking out loud in an age of profound systematic problems, architectural problems like healthcare and all the addictions that you've talked about. It's particularly troubling that people personalize ethics. Everything gets shriveled down to the self, which, as you suggested, is part of a systematic problem rather than a personal problem. Let's move on to space and SpaceX and Musk. You've mentioned him a couple of times. I'm guessing you're not a great fan. I'm sure you know the guy, and you've probably been following his odd trajectory over the last few years. But do you celebrate the privatization of space travel, of SpaceX, of, I guess, Bezos's Blue Origin? What do you make of the replacement of NASA with SpaceX and Blue Origin?
I would say replacement is slightly premature, but yeah, I think the private sector is doing a great job of building spaceships. And ironically, I don't know if you're aware of the two Elon Musks.
I thought there was more than two.
No, I mean there's two basic ones. There's Twitter and Tesla and those, and then there's SpaceX, where the person running things is actually Gwynne Shotwell, who is very, very smart and smart enough not to go out and solicit publicity. She runs things, she's organized, she knows how to talk to NASA, and it's not that I've walked with them into NASA, but you can imagine the two of them going into NASA, and Gwynne says, "Okay, now Elon, just keep quiet. I'll do the talking, and if they ask you, fine, but just let me, this is NASA, they're the government, they don't have a sense of humor." And to his credit, Elon has a great sense of humor. Sometimes it's inappropriate, but what he's done with SpaceX is brilliant, and Gwynne has helped make that work, and mostly safe. I mean, space travel ultimately is never safe, just like the rest of travel, but I do think that's good. The government should pay for the stuff that's not yet commercial. The reality is, going back and forth to space right now is becoming commercial, and I have a bunch of investments in SpaceX and other companies, that, I don't think it should be entirely commercial. It's like healthcare. The government should pay to keep society healthy, but there should be private companies delivering the care, and ideally also it should stop subsidizing corn sugar and stuff like that. We need public investment in the long term, and then we need private investment in things that the private markets will pay for. And space travel is becoming something where the government can pay, but SpaceX is a lot more efficient than most of the large government contractors, let alone the government itself. I mean, it's not that there are a lot of companies that were building all space capacity for years as government contractors. It's not as if SpaceX was actually new. It's just a newer player.
I know you're around. A couple more quick questions, Esther, before we go. Your book is called Term Limits. Some people might hear that and shiver with the idea of thinking about it as a species, given the invention of AI, which some people believe is going to be a replacement, our final invention, as one author suggested. Should or could our species be thinking of term limits too, or is that an inappropriate concept?
It's, anything is appropriate to think about, however good or however evil. And species do get replaced. So I don't consider it beyond the pale. I mean, I always go back to the science fiction story where the Borgs or the bots were looking down on Earth and they think with their meat. Yeah, I mean, most things think electronically. What is this chemical soup that... And, the notion that someday something electronic will become sentient, God bless it if it is better than we are. Less susceptible to things like sugar, perhaps more susceptible to things like electric power. So the idea does not offend me.
Is that our ultimate failing? You've mentioned that several times, our
What?
susceptibility to sugar.
No, it's our susceptibility to short-term relief. I mean, we are dependent on sugar, fat, protein, and lots of different specific nutrients. I mean, that's part of us. Electronics are susceptible to a need for power that ultimately comes from stars primarily, and then chemicals on whatever planet you may be on. It's the short-termness of it, and how shall I say it? May be the original sin or the original weakness of anything that's sentient. For better or worse, we're not perfect. If we were, there would be no point in persisting, because we're perfect, we're done.
Yeah, short term is the human condition. I mean, as Keynes famously said, in the long run, we're all dead. Finally,
but we live on, and that's the point. We live on, and
as ancestors, as Roman Krasnarich would say. So, finally, Esther, you mentioned in 30 years you hope to retire to Mars, but we don't have 30 years. We've got 20 years because we're celebrating the 20th year anniversary of DLD. So, let's think 20 years ahead to January of 2045. What would you like to be doing then? You're not going to be on Mars yet. You're going to have your spacesuit on?
No, I might have more specific plans. Now it's a vague intention. I hope to be doing something useful, probably be doing maybe a fourth book. I don't know. That the one after this is called Present Without Leave, but the one after that, I have no idea. I'd like the world to be a better place. I don't expect it to be perfect. And so I'll still be the aunt or the court jester fussing about making it better.
Well, Esther Dyson, the aunt of the tech community, maybe even the aunt of the
Just
species.
Don't call me the grandmother.
I didn't say that, Esther. You're
No, I know.
putting
That's
words
why-
into my mouth.
Thank
And I
you.
didn't even call you the great aunt, the aunt. Maybe in 20 years you'll be the great aunt, but
I'll be the niece.
You'll be the niece, or you'll be something. Wonderful to talk, and it certainly won't be 20 years before we talk again. Thank you so much. Happy, healthy New Year, Esther. Not too much sugar.
Thank you. That was fun.